Over the course of these videos, I will show you how to create a metadata file and set it up in such a way that it can drive the flow of the process through registration. And the first one that we'll look at is just a standard batch registration setup. So for example, I have a number of files, FCS files, already in a folder. And in addition, there is the .csv, which is the metadata file that will drive the process. And the metadata file should have a column that has the exact file names that are found for the files in the same folder. It can have other metadata columns included as well. For example, we have gender, subject, age, and we have the batch ID. From the batch ID, it goes from 1 to 3, so we can see that there are 3 separate experiments here. And we also have a column that indicates the internal standard for each of these. So there is an internal standard for each of these batches. Now the next piece is we will need to indicate which sample will be our reference. So I'll title it reference. And all I want to do is select batch 1, and we will use our internal standards for this reference. So I will put a 1 here, and that is it. That's all we need for that one. Then we need to define the samples that we want to register. So I'll call this samples to register. And in this case, we want to do registration with the internal standards. So all we need to do is flag the internal standards. And these internal standards will be registered to the reference sample. And it will create a batch shift template for each of these samples that are registered. The batch shift template will then be applied to the individual samples. So we want to also tell it the samples that we want to shift. And in this case, we want all of the samples. So that is all we need to do to set up our batch registration metadata file. In the next example, we'll look at a metadata file that would represent doing a registration with using individual samples and not batch registration. And this file looks slightly different. You can see already that I'll highlight these so that it's easier to see. So since there are no samples being batch registered, we don't have to specify any samples to shift. So technically we could completely remove this column and everything would be fine. We'd have our reference sample. In this case, instead of using the control sample as our reference, we're going to use the entire set of samples. So why you might want to do this is in a situation where, for example, if you didn't have internal standards or internal controls, then you'd still want some way to represent the consensus for that particular batch. So we would simply take this reference sample and indicate all of the samples in that batch to be our reference. This will subset each of those samples and then combine the samples in such a way to create a single concatenate for that batch, which we can use as a reference. And then we would apply the samples to register here by giving everything a 1, and so each individual sample would then be registered according to this reference that we've defined. And I'm not going to use this one, so I won't save it. And in a similar way, if, again, we didn't have internal standards following these batches, we could still do batch registration, and we would specify all of the samples as a set, and this would create a consensus for the entire batch, which would then be used as our reference. And we would have to specify the individual samples in sets as well, and each batch would then make a consensus for that batch that would be registered to the reference. From that, we'd have for each batch a file that describes the shifts that are required, and then we would apply those shifts to the individual samples.